The Yokosuka R2Y2 Kai V3 flies for Japan in War Thunder. For now. Let's check it out. Okay, elephant in the room. This plane, as presented in War Thunder, is almost entirely fictional. The real Yokosuka R2Y1 was a propeller-powered reconnaissance plane built at the end of the war. It was powered by a compound engine that grafted two inverted V12 engine blocks together, similar to the German DB606 power system concept. The only flight of the prototype took place in May 1945, and the new engine system caused some pretty bad problems, requiring the pilot to disengage the engine from the propeller using an emergency shutoff mid-flight. He was able to safely perform a dead stick landing, but the prototype was destroyed in a bombing raid shortly afterwards, and considering the problematic first flight, the decision was made to just abandon the project. However, in an effort to salvage something from all the years of work that they put into the thing, plans were drafted to convert the design into a twin-engined jet-powered tactical bomber to attack American shipping during the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands. Well, several engine layouts were proposed, and the plane was intended to use two Mitsubishi NE330 turbojet engines. The NE330 was another late-war project that was never really finished. The only prototype of the engine was only powered up one time for a static test firing before the factory building it was in got bombed later the same day. While the NE330 was by far the most advanced and most powerful jet engine built by Japan during World War II, only that one example was completed before the war ended. But notably, it did actually work, even if only that one time. Two more prototypes of the R2Y were in construction at the end of the war, and primary sources give some conflicting information if they were the propeller or the jet-powered version, but it's very likely that no metal was actually cut for the jet-powered R2Y2, despite the design being completed on paper. What we get in War Thunder are three versions of the R2Y2. In this review, I'm focusing on the V3, but most of what I'm presenting also applies to the V1 and V2, with only some really minor differences in flight performance. These planes were added to War Thunder back in 2014, basically as top-tier lineup filler for Japan. Gaijin's staff have mentioned during live streams, somewhat recently, that the R2Y2 is slated to be removed from the game at some point. So, if you're at all interested in these jets, or if you're a collector or whatever, grind them out real soon. They're in rank 5 and were recently bumped up to battle rating 8.0. The plane is armed with four 30mm Type 5 cannons. These guns get a few different options for ammo belts, and in my experience, the tracer belt is the most effective at taking out aircraft. Against ground targets, none of the ammo belts are especially good at penetrating armored tanks, so again, I opt for the explosive tracers, which are excellent at destroying lighter targets and still cause pretty good amounts of superficial damage to heavier ones, forcing them to stop and repair. For loadouts, you get a choice of two bombs. I don't normally go into a lot of detail in these reviews about unguided dumb bombs, but in this case, it actually matters. You get two choices, a brown one or a blue one. I'm going to make it easy for you. Just take the blue one. The brown one is an armor-piercing bomb designed for attacking ships, and it does almost no damage to strategic bases and has a tiny 3-meter blast radius, so you basically need a direct hit to kill a ground target. The blue one is a more conventional high-explosive bomb with pretty respectable stats, so again, just take the blue one unless you're flying out against naval targets. There isn't any kind of ballistics computer or anything, so regardless of what you take for the bombs, you're dropping it blind, so get some practice in, or just focus on air combat. The flight performance of the R2Y2 V3 is actually a lot better than you might think. Despite its size, it has good low-speed acceleration, but that kind of tapers off once you get to around 450 kilometers an hour. Its rate of climb isn't that great if you have a bomb hanging off the plane, but if you fly out clean, it can get up to altitude reasonably well, comparable to other entry-level jets. Its energy retention can be good if you're careful and not too aggressive, and it actually turns pretty well. The overall dogfighting agility of this plane can really surprise people, and with a little practice, you can frequently outperform a lot of opponents at 8.3 or lower in a one-on-one fight. Now, the jet can deploy its combat flaps safely up to almost 500 kilometers an hour, so if you need that slight little edge to your turn rate, the option is there. The wings rep at around 950, so if you go into a dive or something from high altitude, watch the throttle because there's no air brake. Importantly though, it pulls out of dives pretty well and the controls don't lock up until you get really close to the red line, and that actually ends up kind of mattering quite a bit during bombing runs. There are some issues though. The plane's rate of roll is pretty bad, and the rudder is strange. It kicks in hard for like 5 degrees, then does nothing. These two factors combine to make aiming the guns a bit more art than science, and honestly, it's really a serious limitation. You'll need to practice with this jet really quite a bit in order to get good with it. The other problem with its performance is that its top-end speed and high-end acceleration are both lower than other jets at its tier, and basically everything you fight can outrun you. And conversely, if somebody wants to engage, you might not have a lot of choice. Overall though, this jet can be a pretty effective dogfighter, and it has a slight performance edge over the two previous versions of the R2Y2. Flying this jet out into air battles forces the choice if you want to take the bomb or not, remembering that you want the blue one unless you're specifically attacking ships. If you take a bomb out, you're usually going to want to fly out like a strike jet, attacking one of the strategic bases and then hunting for air targets. On some maps, you can find a cluster of ground targets to attack, but given that you only get one bomb, it's usually going to give you more points if you hit a base with it. If you go without the bomb, you can use the plane's reasonable climb rate to side climb a bit at the start of a match and put yourself into a good position once you engage. Now, if you do this, you're usually going to miss out on intercepting any bombers in the match, and you'll probably miss out on the opening furball, but it can let you choose your engagements a little better if you can get an altitude advantage early on. Despite being a reasonably good dogfighter, the plane is pretty easy to shoot down, and it doesn't take damage very well, so you've got to try and avoid dog piles whenever possible. In terms of game modes, this jet is perfectly viable in arcade or realistic, and BR 8.0 seems to be right about where most players start making the shift to RB for air battles. One big caveat to mention is the guns. The cannons on this thing are very low velocity with a low cyclic rate, and honestly, they're really hard to use in sustained bursts, since even if you line up the shot right, targets can just fly between your shots, and that seems to happen pretty often. I have better luck shooting in shorter bursts, but at least the plane gets an enormous amount of ammo. Now, flying this thing out as close air support can be a lot of fun, but it's got some limitations. The bomb it gets, the blue one, is pretty strong, and it has no trouble taking out ground targets. But again, no aiming guides of any kind, so you're blind chucking those things, and I'd suggest practicing a bit in test flights. The anti-ground ammo belts for its cannons aren't really effective, but its tracer belts can take out light vehicles a bit easier than you might expect. Visually, I've always thought the R2Y2 kind of looks like a fish. It's not just the paint job, though that certainly adds to it, but that fuselage shape where it's kind of swollen in the middle like that, it just looks like it was made for the water and not for the air. Speaking of paint jobs, you only get one, and it's not great. Overall, I can't rate this plane too highly on the visuals. Landing isn't too difficult, but you may want to set up a longer approach than normal. Without an air brake, and with reasonable energy retention in a shallow dive, it can be a little difficult to bleed off that last bit of airspeed, and since the roll rate is pretty bad, doing S-turns isn't as tight as it is in other planes. The plane can drop its gear and flaps a bit over 300 kilometers an hour. Now, the cockpit on this jet is simply excellent. The canopy bracing isn't as obstructive as you might think at a quick glance, and the visibility is just amazing, with a completely unrestricted view backwards. The instruments are simplistic, but they're not too difficult to find, and the gun sight is intuitive. A+ cockpit. To close out on the R2Y2 Kai V3. This plane gets huge amounts of ammo for its cannons. Its low-speed acceleration is decent, it's got above-average maneuverability for an entry-level jet, and the cockpit is outstanding. However, its cannons have a really low cyclic rate, and they're very difficult to hit with. Its high-end acceleration is crap. Its rate of roll isn't good, and it's pretty close to being a fictional plane, so they're going to remove it from the game eventually. The final verdict on the R2Y2 is that this jet is better than a lot of people probably expect, and honestly, if you play the Japanese air tree, I'd encourage you to try to get these planes while you still can. There's a learning curve, mostly due to the cannons, but they're fun and offer flexible gameplay styles for this BR. As always, thanks for watching.